global trade and economies everywhere took a strong blow from the impact of COVID-19. But even as countries now start to plan their exit and recovery from the pandemic, it seems continued geopolitical uncertainties, particularly U.S. China tensions, will continue to affect trade relations. For an outlook on how the rivalry of superpowers will fare and impact global trade, we speak with Mr. Clyde Prestowitz, founder and president of the Economic Strategy Institute in Washington, D.C. He formerly served as counselor to the Secretary of Commerce in the Reagan Administration and wrote multiple books on Asian economies, the latest of them being The World Turned Upside Down, published last year. It's great to see you, Mr. Prestowitz.
Nice to see you.
Well, we have quite a couple of questions to ask you today. Well, first of all, being this high-level meeting of U.S. Chinese officials in Alaska that we saw this month, and as we all saw, it ended on a very sour note with no indication of the two sides resolving their trade war. Do you expect this tension to continue for the time being?
I'm afraid I think it will, yes. I mean, in fact, even since the meeting in Alaska, we have seen statements and actions in China with regard to other European countries and Australia that seem to actually add heat to the discussion. So I think we're in for quite a period of difficult relations in trade and globalization.
And well, during this months-long, stretching into years-long trade war between Washington and Beijing, U.S. businesses have been complaining that the trade war has really hurt their businesses. It's hurt their supply chains and product development as well, and it's affecting innovation, they say. While on the Chinese side, it's clear that they also want to patch up trade relations, but then obviously there hasn't been a breakthrough in recent weeks or months. And now there's talk of Mr. Biden implementing sort of selective or targeted decoupling of highly sensitive tech sectors. Do you think that is how decoupling is going to look like? And do you think that's enough?
Well, I want to turn the picture around a little bit because I think that decoupling is actually something that China initiated quite a long time ago and has increasingly promoted. If you go back to 1997, the Chinese built the Great Firewall in order to decouple their internet from the worldwide net. If you go to 2005, the Chinese government 5-year economic development plan identified key technologies like semiconductors and artificial intelligence and robotics as targets that China wanted to achieve large-scale production in. Then if you go to 2015, China announced a program Made in China 2025, and they identified about 15 high-tech industries in which they said that for the production of these industries would be all Chinese in 2025. So from our perspective in the U.S., it looks to us as if China is kind of forcing a decoupling. And of course, many of these industries that are very high-tech are not only economically important, but they are strategically important. And as a result, U.S. and other free world countries have responded by trying to strengthen their own industries and trying to offset the impact of the subsidies and the strong government support that the Chinese industries have.
And which industries do you think are in particular need of decoupling, as they can pose a risk to national security as well as trade, of course?
Well, I think that corporations in the current environment, global corporations, need to have a more diversified supply base. So it doesn't mean immediately closing up operations in China and moving to India or Mexico or some other country, but it means beginning to diversify the supply base. And let me add one other thing, because we all agree that global warming is perhaps the greatest danger that the whole world faces. And you have to understand that global supply chains involve a lot of air freight, airplanes, and a lot of sea freight, ships. And airplanes and ships emit a lot of emissions, and the emissions they emit are among the worst kind. We don't charge for that. No country imposes a carbon tax, but maybe we should. And if we did that, we'd be taking a huge united step globally toward fighting global climate change and at the same time diversifying supply chains.
And well, it seems that China has been, for the most part, wanting autonomy, as you said, in terms of producing its own high-tech products and also fostering innovation in that sense. But at the same time, it wants to benefit from global trade. And for most countries, it seems doing business with China has been too enticing to give up. And there have been concerns that Mr. Biden's Made in All of America policy might be a rather inward-looking sort of policy. Do you think there is a danger of this happening? And also, you proposed the Made in All of the Free World policy. What would this look like in contrast?
Well, I think we have no problems if you look at the global economy. There are no serious problems between the EU and Japan and the United States and Korea and Australia and Indonesia and Brazil. I mean, we have our difficulties, but there's no fundamental problem. And I think that all of those countries they have democratic governments and they operate on the basis essentially of market economics. They don't have large parts of their economy dominated by state-owned enterprises. They don't have a political party that has cells operating in every company in the country. So they play by a different set of rules and under different conditions. And those countries don't have any difficulty in engaging in what we call free trade. But in the case of trading with China, we know that the government and the Communist Party have much more control over what happens in the market and even what happens in specific corporations. And that makes it difficult to apply the same free trade rules that we might apply between Korea and the U.S. to the U.S. and China, or to Korea and China. So I think that, in the case of China, it has decided on a particular policy of economic development, and it certainly has every right to do that. Its policy of economic development presents conflicts with the rules and regulations of the World Trade Organization and the trade agreements that have grown up over the past 50 years. So I think what needs to be done is for those countries that are operating in a globally market-based economy simply have to take the steps necessary to maintain their vitality. And we don't have to be antagonistic to China, but I think we just need to say, listen, China, we understand you want to play by a different set of rules. Fine, do it. But then we have to take steps to ensure that the way you play doesn't harm us.
But it doesn't seem like Beijing is interpreting in that sense. It's been coming up with very sharp rhetoric towards countries that are allied with the US, and countries like South Korea and Australia, they've been hit very hard by the sort of economic retaliations that have come from Beijing. And well, in this regard, do you think there can be any way of providing an economic reassurance for allied countries, perhaps by removing US tariffs on steel and aluminium, or perhaps providing more business and investment opportunities?
Well, yes, I believe that the U.S. can take steps, as you said, to remove some of the tariffs on steel or aluminum. But let's be serious; those are not major problems between the U.S. and Korea or Australia or other major countries. Certainly, the U.S. can take steps to make life easier for its allies. But I think the point you made earlier is really the key point. In fact, the UN Council on Human Rights just issued a statement yesterday saying that global corporations operating in Xinjiang, China, were in danger of becoming involved in human trafficking, forced labor, and other actions that are prohibited under UN statutes. And so I think that increasingly, as China has become increasingly powerful economically, it has used that power to kind of act as a bully. It has taken steps, as you know, in Korea. Latte's business in China has virtually wiped out, and not for any market reason and not for anything that Latte did, but because China didn't like a radar being established on land owned by Latte in Korea. Argentina ships lobsters to Shanghai, and then the lobsters are left on the dock by the Chinese. Why? They didn't like the Prime Minister of Australia calling for an investigation of the origin of COVID. Well, the more China does that kind of bully activity, the more it makes it clear that coupling with China can be dangerous to your health.
Well, China, it's also been rather aggressively expanding its investment and influence in developing economies, especially those with more autocratic governments. And it's also been promoting the use of its own currency, the renminbi. Do you see this as a substantial threat to the US?
No, I don't particularly. Let's start with the renminbi. I don't see the renminbi right now as any serious kind of a threat to the US. As long as China's capital markets are not open, not completely open, and as long as China does not have a rule of law, I think it will be very difficult for China to have a major reserve currency. I think that the question of investment, of course, China obtains substantial influence in many developing countries around the world and with many authoritarian countries as a result of its own investment and lending to those countries. And I don't see that at the moment as a major threat, but I think the trend is something that the US and other free world countries need to think about and think about how to respond.
Well, China recently it's announced its goal of becoming, well, perhaps the world's largest economy by 2035, and it intends to lead sectors like AI, 5G, and other emerging technologies. Does this worry you? And also, do you see any areas of collaboration between the United States and South Korea in such sensitive high-tech areas?
Yes, it does worry me. I think that the most important focus of U.S. and free world countries' policy should be on assuring that the free world maintains leadership in the leading edge technologies. Let's take semiconductors as an example. Right now, Taiwan, South Korea, the U.S. are the major manufacturers and designers of semiconductors. It's important that those three countries remain leaders. It would not be helpful if China became a major leader in those technologies. I see a lot of room for collaboration between Samsung, TSMC in Taiwan, Intel, NVIDIA, Qualcomm, other major American companies. The U.S. government, the Biden administration, is already beginning to introduce a program for strengthening the semiconductor industry in the U.S. And I know that the Biden administration is interested in collaboration with Taiwan, South Korea, and other countries that have semiconductor technology capability.
Well, you've noted South Korea's industrial development in the past. What would be your advice to South Korean companies now as they aim to really ramp up their innovation and really rather transition from being fast followers to first movers?
Yeah. Well, I think South Korea is very close to being a first mover in industries like semiconductors. I think two things. I'm not telling you anything you don't know, but South Korea suffers from a problem of aging population. And I think it would be important for South Korean industry to perhaps expand its operations in other countries, in the U.S., in Germany, in Japan, in order to tap the talent in those countries as well as in South Korea. And I also think that South Korea already is a leader in terms of its spending on research and development. As a percent of GDP, South Korea spends more than the U.S. In fact, I've been telling American leaders that we should match what South Korea does. So you're doing very well there. But South Korea is a small, relatively small country, and therefore collaboration in consortia, government industry consortiums with the U.S., with the EU, with Japan, I think would be very good way to go for South Korean industry.
Well, hopefully we'll see some exciting developments there. But this is where we'll leave the interview today. That was Mr. Clyde Prestowitz, founder and president of the Economic Strategy Institute in Washington, D.C. Thank you very much for your insights today.
Thank you. My pleasure. Good to see you.
And to our viewers, as always, thank you very much for watching.